Hello, landlords. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Today we're talking about storm damage. Give me a second. And I'm back. Yeah, we're talking about storm damage and what liabilities landlords have when that storm roughs up your tenants. It's a thing. A couple of weeks ago, everybody was, super nervous about the, blast of the winter vortex. And, I had a lot of panic landlords, remembering a few years ago in the state of Texas, when the electrical grid was overcome and man, there were busted pipes all over the place and trouble for landlords. There were claims left and right, and stuff got pretty messed up. And landlords really didn't know how to respond when their tenants came to them saying, I lost everything, or I lost a significant portion of my personal property. And so, we want to be able to help landlords in these situations. And so, if you've got a situation where, this kind of thing has happened and you have personal experience with this, don't hesitate to share that. Good afternoon. I'm ready for today's sermon. I will preach. I am ready. I promise. Hello. Good to see you guys. I'm always excited to join you, and I'm excited to get started with the topic that has to do with, damage to property. And so we're going to get into your questions, whether you're asking your question on the live or if you've sent a question in. I want to make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to send in their questions. And so if you're on our mailing list, that's an easy way for you to, ahead of time, send in your questions and, I'll study it up. I'll make sure I've got a prepared answer for you. But if something pops up while you're here on the live, don't hesitate to, just ask us here in the chat. Throw it up on the chat. I'll definitely answer it. For those of you who otherwise want to get in early, you can get on our mailing list. You're going to see across the bottom of the screen here our phone number as well as our email address. If you want to get on our mailing list, you can hear from us on a regular basis and send us those questions ahead of time. That's always a good option. Or maybe you are interested in becoming one of the members of our Facebook group. For those of you who are already members of Texas Landlords on Facebook, we have nearly 9,000 members there, all of whom are sharing their experiences, their questions, their insights with each other. We've got people with varying years of experience as property managers, investors, small-time landlords, big-time landlords, everybody throwing in their 2 cents and talking about things regionally. We get people from all over the state of Texas or people from outside of Texas who own property in Texas who are asking questions and learning from each other. I welcome you to join that. That's another place where you can put your question in so that I can get it ahead of time. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you as you afternoon. Chan, how's it going? As you, come up with your questions and are interested in, asking your questions, I look forward to getting those. Let's go ahead and get started. We are talking about, if tenants are harmed during bad weather, how much liability falls on me? And, landlords are legitimately concerned about this. They don't know, where their obligations end and where their rights begin sometimes. And sometimes, especially in the heat of the moment, you're going to get panicked tenants who are going to want to come in and kind of take over the situation. I want to make sure you've got enough data to help you out. So if we're talking about today's topic, if tenants are harmed due to bad weather, how much liability falls on me? Well, some of you already know the answer to this question. Generally speaking, it's 0%. If it's an act of God, it's something completely outside of your control, for the most part, that's not going to have any, it's not going to create any additional liability on you. Most of the time, when a bad storm comes through and it results in some kind of harm to your tenant, most of the time, that's not going to fall on the landlord in terms of liability. So here's a common one. You've got a tree in the front yard, and this giant storm blows through. This happens a lot in Houston. And wouldn't you know, that tree just comes down, boom, right onto the living room, busts through the living room, rain and all sorts of things get inside the house, and a lot of your tenant's personal property is destroyed. Or let's say it doesn't bust through the house, instead it falls on the vehicle of another party. Are you liable? Generally speaking, you are not. However, if that tree was dead and kind of falling over already, then you probably do have liability, especially if the tenant warned you about it and said, I don't think that thing looks good. Can you take it down? And you said, I'll get to it later. That's not a high priority for me right now. And if that's the case, if you find yourself in a situation where you had knowledge of something that resulted in harm, now you have opened the door. Whereas if it were a healthy tree, and again, 100% act of God, it falls and it causes damage to your tenant, zero liability. So yeah, the general rule is if it was completely out of your hands, you have zero liability. But always be wary of those times when you've got actual notice of harm or the potential for harm and a dangerous situation that you can get rid of ahead of time. And so know these things about your property, know whether or not the property itself could lead to harm in the event of bad weather. So that's something for you. The other thing you always want to think about when it comes to weather events and the potential for harm or the resulting harm that comes after it is how you respond in the aftermath. Because you may not have had liability before, but you can develop liability based on your response. If you let things linger for way too long and you have not taken reasonable steps to repair damage that has been incurred on the premises, you might again open the door for liability where generally zero liability exists. So you want to make sure that you're on top of it, number one, and not leaving things that could result in liability, like an old, dead, or dying diseased tree. But then number two, after the storm has blown through, if your property has experienced damage that you're on the hook for, you can't say the tenant caused that property, so you're on the hook for it, you want to make sure you're acting in a reasonable manner. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to work at lightning speed, especially when there's a big weather event. Sometimes supplies are low, or sometimes labor is hard to come by, or you got to wait for your insurance company, especially after a hurricane or some of these bigger events when your own insurance company could be significantly delayed. All of this is taken into account. But if none of those factors are there and you're just sitting on your hands and you'll get around to it eventually, that's when you again open the door to potential liability. And so I just want to make sure that whatever it is you're doing, you're operating with diligence. All right, Crystal, I see that you just popped up with your question. I actually got that question here. I'm gonna respond to it, I promise. So I'm gonna wait on this one until a little bit later, but I do promise I will get to that. Let's move on. Here we go. You don't need to put them in a hotel if the power goes out. If things happen, let's say, for example, power's still on, but you don't have a roof because a tornado came and just whoop, took the roof right off the top of the house. Well, your home is no longer habitable. And so in the state of Texas, we have a mechanism under Chapter 92 of the Property Code. It's 92.054. And what it says is, look, if through some casualty event like a storm, you've lost habitability, right? For all intents and purposes, your rental house is no longer habitable. You can immediately declare it uninhabitable and tell your tenants, sorry guys, it's over. There is no lease. I will refund a prorated amount of your prepaid rent and your full security deposit, but this lease is over. No, you don't have to put them up in a hotel. No, you don't have to go find some other unit that you've already got vacant where they can go in the meantime. You can just bring your tenancy to an end if the unit becomes completely or essentially uninhabitable 100%. Now, the complications come when, uninhabitability is limited to, say, 20% or 30%. That's significant. If 70% of the house can still be used just fine, the fact that 20 or 30 or even 40% of the house is uninhabitable after some casualty event doesn't mean that they're off the hook. Right? Now, it probably means, and here's where the property code is important to know, it probably means that they're due some diminished value of rent in the meantime. So if it takes you 30 days to fix it and they lost 40% of the use of the rental property, then maybe they get a 40% discount for that 1 month of rent, and that's fair. Now that's between you guys to work out. Again, the longer that they're without it, the bigger the discount. The shorter amount of time, the less money you actually have to give up in rent. But the property code does address this issue when the house is still usable, but some portion of it is rendered uninhabitable for a brief period of time through no fault of either the landlord or the tenant. So, think about these things. Make sure you are cognizant of the fact that storms could cause significant enough damage to make the home uninhabitable. And when that happens, the thing that's the most important is that you act with diligence. As long as you're doing that and you know what the law says, you know where the boundary is, you're going to be just fine. All right, so what's the next thing that you should consider when there's weather damage? You don't need to replace furniture. You don't need to replace the things that the tenant lost. Your lease doesn't in any way say, and in fact, it should say quite the opposite. The lease doesn't say anywhere that says, by the way, if something bad happens to you or any of your stuff, I will replace it. Understand that even if you file an insurance claim and your insurance company writes you a big fat check, that essentially none of that covers your tenant's personal property, no matter what happens. Let's say, for example, you've got a wall and the wall, after the storm, just falls down and crushes their car. I actually had a client during a storm whose roof came off and fell, landed on the tenant's car. And then the tenant was saying, hey, you owe me a new car. Your roof destroyed my car. And that just isn't the case. Her lease was very clear. It was a good lease. And it was very clear. It said, look, I don't have any liability for acts of God, for things that are outside of my control, that were caused by the weather. You assume full responsibility for your personal property. And if it turns out that through some, again, act of God, some casualty loss, my property harms your property, you agree that I don't owe you anything. And that's just kind of the hard truth, that just because they lost things due to some bad weather event, that doesn't mean that you have to replace their living room furniture. It doesn't mean you have to replace their entire vehicle or their clothing or their electronics because something happened outside of your control. Now, again, you would have to have some kind of fault in order for loss to be in any way connected to you, for you to somehow suddenly have liability in the event of some casualty loss. But short of that, zero liability. Don't let them tell you otherwise. Neither the law nor your lease likely say that you'll cover them when they lose their personal property. Instead, what I would encourage you to do is Encourage your tenants to purchase renter's insurance to cover casualty losses. This is a common thing that a lot of people overlook. Your lease could actually require your tenants to purchase their own renter's insurance to cover their losses in these kinds of events. It's usually not that expensive, and if ever there is some event like a flood or a fire or a storm that causes damage to their personal property, then it's that insurance that should kick in. And maybe, depending on their coverage, they'll get things like a hotel stay, they'll get things like lost time at work, or they'll get things like replacement costs on all of their personal property. But neither your insurance nor you as an individual would have personal liability in a situation like this. And this is the perfect opportunity for you to, encourage your tenants to just purchase their own insurance. It helps them because and you can just flat out tell them, look, I'm insured to the gills. My structure has insurance, my business practices, and you should, are insured, but your stuff and the things you do not have insurance. Now, those are two different policies. So they can get insurance to cover their stuff. They can also, and this is another thing I encourage, they can also get insurance for their acts and omissions so that they do something that results in harm to you or to a third party. Now they've got insurance to cover those acts or omissions that result in harm to either you or to somebody else. That's a different kind of insurance. Right now, we're basically talking about personal property belonging to the tenants. But remember, your insurance, whether you've got landlord insurance, which you should have, and you've got insurance for your structure, which you should have, or any kind of vandalism insurance. You've got all sorts of insurance that apply to your rental property. None of that's going to cover their personal stuff. Make sure you're upfront with them, and you might consider your lease containing a clause that requires them to have it. Now, that may not be an evictable offense on your radar. But if you do require it in their lease and they suddenly say, hey, I've been damaged, yada, 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 you owe me X, Y, or Z, guess what you can point to in your lease? That's right, that provision. And if they don't have insurance to cover their losses in a situation like this, they're the ones technically at fault. You have no harm, no blame, no liability. So I hope this was really helpful to you guys. I want to make sure that the things that we talk about here and the things that I teach are helpful and practical for you to use, because these things will pop up. And so I want to go ahead and jump into the questions. Crystal, you are welcome. I'm going to get to your question right here, right now. For those of you who have not submitted a question yet, feel free to add your question in the chat. I'm going to do my best to answer. Understand that, I practice in Texas, and so I'm limited to Texas law. If you're watching from out of state, I don't do out of state litigation, but I'll do my best to answer general issues in a general way that might be helpful to you. I'm happy to do that. So first, let's get to this question. If I bought a house with an FHA loan, do I have to let the tenants have a 30-day notice instead of a 3, and why? Now, this is an excellent question because it reminds me of the past. And we go back to COVID. So the reason that we're even talking about a potential 30-day notice here, because the default in the state of Texas is a 3-day notice, and that's true in many states. But the reason that we're talking about this is because during COVID, Congress passed what was called the USA CARES Act back in March of 2020. And among other things in that act was this 30-day notice requirement. The first part of it was that there was an absolute ban on evictions for a certain period of time. That ended. But then there was a segment of it that never went away. It never sunset. It didn't have an ending in it. And so it's live through today that says that if you purchase property and it's subject to some kind of federal funding, And so, is it backed up by Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae? Those are some keys. But if you've got a federally backed loan for rental property, you're subject to this 30-day requirement in the CARES Act. However, in the state of Texas, that no longer applies. So as of January 1st, 2026, the state of Texas said, look, we're no longer requiring this in Texas courts for landlords. Instead, the only thing that has to happen to meet the requirements of the CARES Act is that from notice to the exercising of a writ of possession. That's where the constables forcibly remove any person from the property. From that day to the writ date, and I'm talking about execution of the writ, not even purchase of the writ, you have to have at least 30 days. I've been doing this for 15 years. I've never once seen it go from notice to exercising a writ in under 30 days. It's going to be at least a 30 to 40 day process. And so I think you're pretty well covered. What the law of the state of Texas now requires is that you send a 3-day notice. But if it turns out that you get your judgment so lightning fast that the constables are ready to go and enforce that, and 30 days have not passed from the date of your notice to vacate, then you got to wait until day 31 and after before you can exercise that writ. Again, the likelihood of that being a thing, very, very low, but that's really where it comes. It's no longer required in the state of Texas. It's no longer required in your notice to vacate, but it might be required, that 30-day wait in the entire process. And again, if you're getting your house back through a writ of possession in under 30 days, that just means that things are going lightning fast in your case. That's not normal. That's not a usual thing. So, all right, we got some comments that just popped up. Let's see what we got here. I require renter's insurance because it also has a provision in it for liability in case of fire, etc. Yeah, so that's a little bit different. That's liability insurance for your tenants. That liability component is really big, and it's something that I tend to recommend to landlords who lease property to tenants who have pets. And so a liability requirement in the insurance for the tenant that names you as an additional insured could help in the event that little Scruffy, who has no history of biting, all of a sudden turns into a mad dog and goes and bites every kid in the neighborhood, and suddenly you're getting flooded with lawsuits, but they've got insurance to cover those claims. You're gonna rest a lot easier knowing that there's a liability policy there that the tenants can use to cover that kind of claim. So that's a good way to do things. All right. Did I hear you say that not having renter's insurance, even if the lease requires it, would not be an evictable offense? Can you clarify that, please? Yeah. So a landlord, can require it for purposes of helping out the tenant. So if it's just a policy that covers the tenant stuff, I don't know that a court is going to grant an eviction for that, because the landlord doesn't lose anything if the tenant decides not to. This is really a risk for the tenant only. So I doubt very heavily that any court is going to say that's a reason why I'm granting this eviction. The tenant pays rent. They follow every other provision in the lease, except for this provision requiring them to buy insurance to protect their own stuff. I just don't see it happening. And so, but again, if you do have it in your lease and it turns out that they're not trying to hit you with some kind of claim, it's good defense for you to be able to point out, look, you were required to have this the whole time. The fact that you don't is 100% on you. So, what is the name for professional or business practice insurance, and can landlords who manage their own rental property also buy that insurance, or is this for professional property management companies? So it's going to depend on what your insurance provider calls it. They can call it all sorts of things, but essentially it has to do with your own liability. So it's your own professional liability insurance, and exactly what's covered, that's between you and your insurance provider. Every insurance company is going to do things a little bit differently, and they're going to call things a little bit different, but it essentially has to do with your business practice and the liabilities that you have for the way you operate your business. Let me give you a simple example. Let's say you're a do-it-yourself, everything kind of guy. And among those things, among the property management, you do your own repairs. And there you go, and you're working on some plumbing, and you're like, got it. And then you walk out, you even patch up the wall, and everything's great. And then there's a rupture. There's a rupture, but it is tiny, right? Tiny rupture because you did bad work, and it leaks and leaks and leaks, and it fills that back wall, and summer comes and it gets really hot, and you've got moisture behind that wall, and wouldn't you know it, after a while, boom, 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 mold everywhere in the house. Everybody's sick. They don't know why because they can't see it, but all of a sudden it begins to creep through the wall, and there it is, mold everywhere that you caused. That's not a casualty event. That's not caused by accident. It wasn't just a rupture of an old pipe or just from normal wear and tear. You went and you did the work and you didn't do it well. That resulted in your own losses. So any claims that might derive from that act could fall on you personally. And so it might be a good idea for you to have your own insurance to cover your business practices, including your own handyman work. And so that's just an example of where your act or omission, result in something. Omission might be, they kept telling you, hey, there's something weird. I see something on the ceiling. It looks like water damage. I don't know what caused it, but it's getting worse. And you neglected and you neglected and you neglected. And all of a sudden they're like, yeah, that spot, it's gotten bigger. It used to be kind of the size of a quarter. Now it looks like a watermelon, and it's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then one day they're sitting on their lazy boy, and all of a sudden the ceiling caves in and falls on them, and they are injured now. They have some claim against you due to your omission. So that wasn't something you did, that was something you failed to do that resulted in injury. And so again, good insurance will cover stuff like that. I hope that helps. Ernie, can we charge a tenant who moved out with no notice, left a roach infestation, water damage on the wall that I just painted? The whole inside 1 year, 6 months ago looks excessive to me. So here's what you can always bill your tenants for damages on the premises that exceed ordinary use or normal wear and tear. And so roach infestation, that's going to depend. Who had the obligation to keep roaches out? Who was in charge of pest control? If in your lease you say, hey, bub, I got this, I'm on it for pest control. Or if your lease says the tenant has 100% responsibility to regulate pests on the property, then that, again, could be a charge against the tenant. Water damage on the wall, again, it's going to depend what caused it. Was it a leak behind the wall, or was it something they did that you can prove they did? So through their negligence or misuse of the property, that resulted in harm. So, one that could come in, it's the kids' bathroom, right? And so in the kids' bathroom, kids are terrible. And so I know my kids certainly are, and they'll leave wet towels or they'll leave water, and then water will kind of just get to places where it's not supposed to be. And it ruins things like particle board. It ruins things like sheetrock. It ruins things like carpet if you leave it there long enough. So you got to be able to prove that your tenants acted with negligence, or they ruined something or caused harm through misuse. Then yes, you can charge them. But the biggest one here is leaving without notice. So they probably owe rent. They might even owe accelerated rent, depending on how many additional months were still left on the lease. All these things are chargeable. But I always tell landlords to consider two things when they want to go after a tenant that just packed up and took off. Number one, can you find them? Because if you can't find them, you can't sue them. That's a basic principle in litigation. But number two, let's say you can find them. You know either where they live or where they work so that you can get that lawsuit in their hand, personal service of the lawsuit in their hand. The next question, equally important, if you do find them and you do sue them and you do win, how likely are you to recover your losses from them? Because it doesn't help for you to win a $20,000 lawsuit against somebody who doesn't have $20 to their name. That's just a waste of your time and effort. So you'd be surprised how many times I get people to come into my office who are red hot, ready to file that lawsuit, and I tell them, you can win this lawsuit and I can make a lot of money representing you all the way to judgment. But I don't think I can recommend that you file this lawsuit because of what you've told me about your expectation of recovery. Now, sometimes landlords say, Ernie, I don't even care about that. This is a matter of principle. I want to sue this tenant. Fine, that's fine. But, you know, if you're doing it just for principle, I guarantee you that that's not nearly as good as doing it for money. And so ask yourself, can I find them? And do I have a reasonable expectation I'm ever going to get this money back? So those are the things you consider in these situations. Okay. What if property was poorly maintained, leaky roof prior to the storm? Again, acts and omissions, right? And so if the harm that a tenant experiences, you know, is the result of the landlord's negligence, then yeah, just like keeping a dead or dying tree in the front yard, you know, the fact that the storm came through, I mean, that was just the last straw. You set yourself up for a claim by neglecting your dead or dying tree or by leaving a damaged roof. Now, you have to, you know, there has to be proof that you knew about it. So if you had no idea the tree was dead or dying, you had no idea the roof had issues, different story. Because a lot of it depends on whether or not, you know, a tenant can prove that you had actual knowledge of the defect. And it's really a standard of known or should have known. And so these get way into the weeds. I'm not going to go too deep in it, but that's essentially the key. Did you know or should have known this thing that resulted in additional harm that wouldn't have happened, even through act of God, if you had done your part? So that's what you think about in these situations. What about tenant liability insurance? Yes, again, like with the dog bite incident, I tend to recommend to landlords, if you've got tenants with kids or with dogs or other pets that might, you know, it's not bad to recommend tenant liability insurance of all of your tenants, but not everybody's into that. Not everybody thinks that that's necessary. Again, as a guy who deals with this kind of stuff all the time, I would say it's not a bad recommendation. But yeah, if you've required them to have liability insurance and they refuse, that's different because that puts you and your property at risk. So what do I tend to advise landlords in this situation? A 3 strikes and you're out series of notices. So notice number 1, hey, I noticed that either the insurance that you started off with has lapsed and you haven't renewed it. You need to renew it. You need to get insurance. Here's your notice. I'm giving you 7 days. Doesn't happen. Here's your second notice. I'm giving you another 7 days. Please get it. You know, if this continues, you know, I might have to evict you. And sure enough, they don't get it. Third notice, you say, look, this is the last time I'm going to mention it. Please get it. Your next notice is going to be a notice to vacate. And here it is, your final attempt to get them to do the right thing. They don't. At that point, I think you are well within your rights to send a notice to vacate and proceed with eviction, because you've been reasonable in the notice that you've given to your tenant and reasonable for the basis that you are evicting. Again, if there's liability requirement as part of your agreement and that's what you bargained for and they agree to it, now I think you do have a greater risk that you're having to prove to the court, and because of that risk, I think you have a stronger claim than if it's just renter's insurance for their personal property. So I hope that helps. What if the renter's insurance requirement is also for tenant liability insurance? Yeah, you can do both. And so in my lease, I let landlords choose, and I give them an either or both option. And some, they just say, look, I don't care about insurance. I'm not going to do it. I counsel them against that. Others, they leave it completely optional. And that's another way that you could go. And still others say, well, I'll do one, but not both. And very few people say, yeah, I want to require both their property insurance as well as their liability policy. And I need to see proof of that before I hand over the keys. So yeah, there's lots of ways to do this. That's just one. You're welcome. Appreciate you asking your questions. Let's get on to this next one. My tenant left items exposed to snowstorm, which caused a pipe to burst. He is not ready to accept as tenant fault and asking landlord to fix it. What can be done to charge tenant this negligence? Well, that's going to depend on what your lease requires, and it's going to depend on whether or not the tenant is on the hook. I don't know what your lease says. I don't have it in front of me. But assuming that the tenant had proper knowledge, proper notice, and failed to do what was their requirement, yeah, you can say that the damage that resulted to your property was not from normal use or ordinary wear and tear. It resulted from their misuse or their negligence. So that's going to be an issue for the court to resolve. From a distance, I can't always say 100% of the time it's the tenant's responsibility or the landlord's responsibility. It really depends on what precisely transpired there. Let me give you an example. Let's say that your lease specifically says, I have covers for the outside faucets, and those covers are in the garage. You agree that during every freeze, you'll remove the water hoses and you'll put those inside the garage, and you'll put these faucet covers on while the freezing temperatures persist. And they maybe that's in your house rules, maybe that's in your, the lease proper, who knows? But that's part of your agreement, and they agreed to it. They left the water hose connected, they forgot to put the cover on, and you can prove that that failure is what resulted in damage to your property. If that's the case, then yeah, you can hit them for negligence or for violation of the lease by just not following what they were supposed to do. So that's just an example. You have to be able to prove that that was the cause, that was the intervening cause of the damage to your property. And yes, you could charge that to your tenant. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can do that. You can either pay to get it replaced, pay to get it repaired and then issue them a bill, or you could ultimately deduct it from the security deposit. I don't recommend that one so much, but it is an option. My preference would be bill them during the tenancy and say, look, this is part of your obligation. Your failure to do this could itself result in an eviction. So that's one way to handle it. I hope that helps. So I'm gonna get to some additional questions. I got another question here that I pre-prepared that I want to get to. This is also from Victoria Rodriguez. What if a tenant who takes advantage of my online payment portal, knowing it'll attempt to go through when there's no funds and takes days of processing to let me know, can I ask her to sign an amendment stating I will only take cash, money orders, or cashier's checks from her, and I don't do this to the rest of my tenants because they're not doing what she is? That sounds way complicated, and it does sound like if you're not doing it for everybody, or it's not a requirement of your lease, I wouldn't do it. Instead, I would just enforce your regular lease. If she's fake paying and it turns out that the money isn't there and she's just using this as a stall tactic, that's a violation of the lease. Late payment is violation. And so you always want to give her notice. So I don't know these facts because I didn't get these facts, but let's say, for example, the tenant fake pays on the 1st, knowing it's going to take at least 6 days, and like, oh my gosh, it didn't go through. Here it is on day 7, my payment. Well, your lease should have a clause in there that says your payment isn't timely until I receive it. And so if it's marked as paid on the portal and you ultimately receive it through that portal, well, you denote it from the date that the payment was submitted. But if it's marked as paid on the portal, but you never receive it because, again, fake pay, then yeah, on the 7th, it is late. So I would strongly encourage you, if you do accept the rent, to issue a notice of default for late payment. And if it happens again, do that again. But if it happens the very next month, you can just say, that's it, you got to go. Here's a notice to vacate. Now, the law in the state of Texas for late or non-payment requires you to issue now, and a lot of people don't know this. I got a video on it from earlier this year and late last year. The laws changed on January 1st, 2026 in the state of Texas, so that if you're going to issue a notice to vacate, and it's the first delinquency having to do with rent, and if that's the only basis for you issuing a notice to vacate, you must issue a notice to pay or vacate. But if you've got record and they were clearly late last time, and that's easy to prove because you gave them a notice of default, well, then this month you can say, look, I'm not even taking your payment, just get out. You were delinquent last month, you're delinquent again this month, you got to go. And so I don't know if that's your strategy or not, but if you're not delivering notices of default and letting your tenant know, look, repeated notices of default will result in eviction. Please make sure you are paying on time. Whatever method you employ, make sure you are actually paying so that I actually receive it. I think that's a better message than coming up with a different procedure that you're not applying to all tenants. I hope that was helpful. Okay. Here we go. Looks like to me you're going to have to do a sermon on renter's insurance, property insurance, liability insurance, and the differences. Actually, I've got something in the works. I'm not an insurance expert, but I do know an insurance expert, and he and I will get together. I am planning it out. We're going to do a whole video just on insurance because I know that people need to hear it and the kinds of things that are available. Again, I have a vague understanding of what's there, but I'm going to bring somebody who speaks in insurance and he'll be able to give you a lot of great information. Thank you for answering my questions. You are very, very welcome. Can we install security camera outside the property to ensure property is safely maintained? Only outdoor cameras and no inside property cameras. Yes, probably. Unless you've got some kind of prohibition of installing cameras in your lease, yes, you can install cameras outside your property to secure the property and make sure the property is safe. I think Ring doorbell cameras are very popular, and they're a good way, number one, to see who's approaching the house in the event of theft. They also sometimes serve as a good way to know whether or not unauthorized occupants are staying on the property. Now, they're not always going to come through the front door, and if they're really clever, they'll avoid that Ring camera. But it is one thing that you can use, especially toward the end of a tenancy when you're not sure if a tenant is in fact moving out. That Ring camera will show you, whoop, that's them. There's their moving truck. There's box, 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 couch, bed, box, box, box. They're gone. And so, I tend to advocate, doorbell cameras, that sort of thing. But yes, you generally can put cameras outside of your property. That is generally not a problem. Okay, we got one more. Ernie, in your opinion, what is excessive for having to repaint after 1 year and 6 months of a tenancy? It was completely painted right before the tenants move in. Of your answer, sorry, I missed it. Again, it's very fact specific, so it's going to depend precisely what was done. So if, for example, you've got these bright white walls, and a 6-year-old was living there, and it was painted just a year and a half ago. A 6-year-old was living in the house. They moved out, and on their way out, they took a Crayola marker and did one of these things. They got this bright red slosh right there. You're not going to get compensated for painting the whole house again for one little Crayola, slosh. Generally speaking, that can be cleaned up, and so that's not going to cut it. But let's say instead they punched holes or they installed multiple TVs and tore them out of the walls, leaving gaping holes, or the doorknobs were clearly forced through the wall in anger sometimes. Sometimes people punch holes in walls in anger, or they break the baseboards, or their furniture scratches up against the paint. There's all sorts of reasons why a little touch up isn't going to cover it. So again, it has to be some normal use that can easily be remedied. Something excessive, you're going to have to repaint. Now again, you don't get the whole house. It's going to be whatever it costs to repair the damaged area that they caused. If you repaint the whole house, you're gonna have to figure out what did it cost just for the damage they caused. Yeah, I kind of wanted to upgrade the whole thing. You don't get that for free. You get just what they damaged at most. So keep that in mind, please. Okay, weeks after a storm, what if tenant claims mold is making the property unlivable? That's entirely possible. Tenant does not want to move. That's dumb. Wants landlord to remedy. Well, that's going to depend. If the place is uninhabitable, that argument is very much undercut by somebody saying, but I love habiting here. It's either inhabitable or it's uninhabitable. It cannot be both, except that it could be, like I talked about earlier, it could be that only a portion of the property is uninhabitable. And so now you've got a diminished value of rent. Again, we talked about the 10, 20, 30, or 40% of the house being uninhabitable, but the rest of the house being perfectly fine. Well, yeah, the landlord can remedy it, get in there, clean it up, fix it up, make sure there is no mold left, and make sure that the source of that mold is ultimately what's remedied first. But everything's patched up and ready to go, then yeah, you can talk about diminished value for not having access to that 40% or whatever the percent is. That's perfectly fair. In fact, the law anticipates a good landlord doing exactly that. And so it's going to depend on what's going on there. Remediation will cost thousands of dollars. No mold insurance in Texas. Yeah, that's a responsibility of the landlord. And so the tenant is there, and the obligation of the landlord is you're there to the end. Now, if this happened through, again, a casualty event like a storm, and nobody expected it to happen, and the house is rendered a complete loss, well, then the landlord's option is very simple. Issue a notice of termination based on 92.054 of the Texas Property Code. Based on the Property Code and based on this declaration of a 100% loss that was in no way due to an act or omission of the landlord, yeah, the landlord can just terminate it, get rid of those tenants, get in there, get the job done, and then release it to somebody else once that problem has been remedied. But if a tenant stays, they're kind of assuming the risk of any harm that might come, once they've notified you and said, hey, 100% uninhabitable, but I'm just going to sit here and keep breathing in this moldy air because I love it here. Not very wise if it's accurate. My guess is it's probably not 100% issue. It's probably some lesser amount. But yeah, at that point, it is the responsibility of the landlord to remedy the situation. So let us move on. We've got another question here. This is from Jose Lira. Do I need to pay the utility bill even though rent is not paid? I stipulate, and the tenant initialed adjacent to the note on the lease contract, that rent is used to pay for utilities, and failure to pay rent may cause interruption of a service by provider, not landlord, plus additional reactivation fees? Or do you suggest a better phrase that has better standing ground? As I understand, electricity cannot just be turned off by the landlord, especially if it's not paid separately by the tenant. Now, Jose gave me a few extra details. I want to read those. I didn't want to crowd up the note. He said, I have a rent house where the electricity is included with the rent. Okay. However, tenant has defaulted now 45 days on rent. The electric bill is now due. Electric services will be disconnected by the electric provider due to non-payment. Well, here's the problem, Jose. They're due because you have failed to pay rent. It sounds like you have your contract and the utilities are in your name. Unfortunately, that's a risk that you assume by doing the rental in this way. If it's at all possible, I tend to recommend to landlords never keep the utilities in your name, because at the very least, if things go downhill and the tenant stops paying their utilities, the utility company can shut it off for the named party. But if you, the landlord, are the named party, you do not have the right to just let those utilities go into default. And so, could you use some of the security deposit funds to pay just those utilities? You definitely could, but don't let this go on so long that, you're 45 days in. Again, my recommendation is 7 days. If in 7 days you haven't gotten 100% of the rent you're owed, notice to vacate. Get rid of this tenant, because ultimately your losses are going to exceed the security deposit. Ultimately, your losses are going to be so great, you're not going to be able to recover well based on what's left in the security deposit and what the tenant is at that point willing to pay. So number one, evict faster. Number two, no, you don't have the right to do this. If you want, if you choose, that is, to do an all bills paid sort of situation, you run this risk every time. You have to keep paying the utility bills. You cannot shut off your tenant. Now, there is a way. The law does allow, if you have a specific billing criteria for your tenant, to handle the utilities through them by way of you. But it's complicated, and I just don't recommend it, because you can get it wrong. If you don't know what you're doing in terms of, apartment complexes do this sometimes. They got to split the utilities. And so they've got a very specific system for how to do that. Again, for a single family home, I just don't recommend. For a small landlord, I just don't recommend doing it. It's a lot easier, just if you can, to let them put all the utilities in their name. And if you can't, then, do your best to collect a more substantial security deposit. And the moment something like this happens, notice to vacate. Get rid of that tenant, because it's just going to be bad news. And no, if you're thinking you can shut off these utilities, you're gonna put yourself at risk for a huge loss, because the code has very strict penalties for illegal utility shut off. It's not something that I ever recommend. So I hope that helps. But in the future, yeah, if you can get your tenant to pay 100% of their own utilities, that is the best method. Oh, Okay, great. Well, I think that was the last of our questions. Guys, it was really great sharing some time with you. I look forward to seeing you guys next week. Next week, we've got a new topic. How does early lease termination work? I get this question probably every single week. I get people who come in who are interested in terminating a lease or interested in drafting an early termination provision in their lease. What does that look like? I want to talk all the good, the bad, and the ugly of lease termination, because I guarantee you it gets real bad, real fast, and real ugly sometimes. So, between now and then, thank you very much. I always love it when you guys show up and are supportive. But between now and then, I hope you guys have a great week. Again, next time, Wednesday, 4 o'clock. If you've got a question for me, shoot us an email, meet us on Facebook, and supply your questions ahead of time. I look forward to answering them. And until next time, landlords, thank you very much for joining. Happy leasing. You are very welcome. I always appreciate you guys showing up. Can we give Wi-Fi to a tenant as security camera and appliances need Wi-Fi to manage? You definitely can. I sometimes recommend that you install in your house your own remote Wi-Fi that's specific just for your Ring Cam. There are ways to do it. Sometimes cell phone companies provide these little remote Wi-Fi things that you can just put in a box in the attic, connect it to the power. It's pretty simple. You can mention it in your lease that they're not allowed to touch that sort of thing. But yes, we could go on forever. I appreciate you guys. I'm happy to answer your questions as always. But for now, we're wrapping things up. Thanks so much. Have a great week. And until next time, landlords, happy leasing.